I would firstly like to acknowledge Ambassador Pramano from Indonesia, who joins us here today. 2 weeks from today, on the 12th of October, it will be 20 years since the dreadful news reached us from Bali. On that anniversary, I will be in Coogee commemorating the events of that shattering night. That night when the names of the Sari Club and the Paddy's Bar were stamped with such brutality into our collective conscience. That night when they were joined forever with the names of the 202 people who were murdered that night. 88 of them were Australians. They were not combatants in a war. They were visitors and locals alike. They were gathered in a place of joy because, as Australians have for so long known and cherished, few places are as welcoming as Indonesia. But amid the joy, there was malice. Terrorists who brought their depravity to Bali. For most of us, what happened in that moment is beyond imagining. The sudden terrible light, the sudden terrible darkness, the flames. We will always come back to those whose lives were ended. Alongside the local workers and residents were teammates enjoying their end-of-season holiday, including members of the Kingsley Football Club, Sturt Football Club, the Southport Sharks, the Coogee Dolphins, and from my own electorate, the Dulwich Newtown Basketball Club. Members of a wedding party, friends celebrating a 40th birthday, mates on their first overseas trip, friends on a scuba trip, wives and husbands, mothers and daughters, including from my electorate Debbie Borgia and her daughter Abby. In one of the accidents of timing that haunts us still, Debbie and Abby were meant to have flown out of Bali that day, but the plane was overbooked. Abby was the youngest Australian to die. She was just 13, one of 4 teens taken that night before they ever got to experience adulthood. Debbie and Abby were 2 of the bright lights taken from my own community in the inner west of Sydney, and both have been commemorated with the Debbie and Abby Borgia Community Recreation Centre on Illawarra Road in Still Park in Marrickville. It is fitting that their memories, and all the years they never got to live, have been honoured with a place that is so vivid with life. We think of all the futures that were stolen that night. It was such a youthful crowd, young adults just starting out on the next stage of life's grand adventure, fiancés about to know the happiness of marriage, couples about to know the joy of parenthood. We think of Stacey and Justin Lee. Just before they left for Bali, Stacey found out she was with child. We think of all the dreams that were never fulfilled, every life milestone that was never reached, never celebrated, every conversation never had, every moment of love never known. We think of David and Claire Marsh, who ended up working around the clock to save life and limb. We think of Gilani Paul and her New Zealander husband Richard, who set up a makeshift triage area in the foyer of the Bounty Hotel. What they all saw that night will never leave them. Yet amid it all, one familiar theme emerged: the very worst of circumstances bringing out the very best in people. Amid the suffering, there was such extraordinary heroism. Natalie Gould was just one of the survivors of the blast who promptly risked her life by heading into the flames to help friend and stranger alike. As her friend Nicole McLean later put it, if it wasn't for her, I probably wouldn't be here. If I could dip her in gold and pin her on my chest, I would. Then there was Haji Agus Bang Bang Priyontu, a public servant in charge of parking in central Kuta that night. As Tony Wright wrote, he spent 3 hours helping evacuate the living and then another 8 hours helping remove the dead. and he just kept coming back. Back in Australia at the Royal Perth Hospital, Dr Fiona Wood led a team of 250 staff who treated many of the badly burned survivors evacuated to Australia. We can never overestimate the difference made by Dr Wood's remarkable invention of the spray-on skin technique and the difference it continues to make. We also think with gratitude to every Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade and consular official who bore the brunt of this most difficult of tasks. All the members of the Australian Defence Force who worked on the ground and carried out evacuations, and all of the officers of the Australian Federal Police and all the members of the Indonesian National Police who worked together in the spirit of cooperation that is so much at the heart of the friendship between our two nations. That night, the terrorists were able to execute the mechanics of their plan. Their bombs worked and they inflicted the carnage that they desired, but they could not achieve their aim. They miscalculated when they attacked us. What they struck, they could not defeat, because what they struck at was the idea of us, the great fabric of dreams and ideals and compassion and fairness that make us who we are. Indonesians, Australians, people from all around the world. They struck at the friendship between us. They struck at freedom. They struck at the joy of a free people. And they struck at love. But we remain. In the end, they reminded us of what is so important to us and to not take for granted what we have built and nurtured over generations. They sought to create terror, but people ran towards the terror to do what they could for friend and stranger alike. These were acts of defiance as well as acts of great humanity. They ran because they followed a higher, more human instinct than those who attacked them. What the architects of this slaughter achieved was to make us reflect on what we most truly value and to hold it more tightly than ever before. No terrorist can ever take this from us. But they did take life. They left survivors to rebuild themselves physically and mentally. They left families and friends struggling with loss. For them, the world could never be the same again. 20 years on, so many hearts are still tethered to that cruel night, every beat tempered by an abiding sorrow. Grief, of course, is its own creature. It doesn't travel in straight lines. Many currents were stopped in the great river of life that night, and some are still stranded on the bank, unable to walk away. Grief may soften with time, but it does not fade. As my predecessor, Julia Gillard, put it on the 10th anniversary, Bali is, to quote the former Prime Minister, a place like London and Gallipoli where something of the Australian spirit dwells upon another shore. And what a beloved shore it is. Indonesian people have reached out to generations of Australians as friends and neighbours. They felt our great pain that night, and we felt theirs. We came together as a society, as a nation, and as neighbours. The powerful bond that exists between Australia and Indonesia grows only stronger. In areas of intelligence sharing, law enforcement, critical care and trauma response, our two nations have been guided by a powerful spirit of cooperation. And I thank President Widodo for his welcome earlier this year. On the 12th of October, one face that will be missing is Nick Way, the Channel 10 journalist who reported in Bali. He was president of the Bali Peace Park Association and played a role in the lives of survivors. Nick died last Friday, and I know his presence will be greatly missed. And I pay my condolences on behalf of the Parliament to Nick's family and his many, many friends. As we mark the anniversary of everyone who was lost, of everyone who was hurt, of everyone who carries the loss, we will commemorate them from Bali to Coogee, Dulwich Hill to Perth. There's a commemoration every year at a garden that is at Petersham Town Hall in my own electorate. We will hold them in all of our hearts. We will think of everyone who never came home. We will think of all the survivors we have lost since. We hold on to their names and faces, and we will never let them fade. And I move, Mr Speaker, formally, that the House 1 acknowledges 12 October 2022 marks 20 years since that terrible night in Kuta, Bali, where 202 innocent lives, including 88 Australians, were lost in the Bali bombings. And B, this date will be a difficult day for many Australians and Indonesians, as well as people around the world, whose lives were changed forever that night and who continue to feel the impact of this senseless act. 2, recognises A, the brave efforts of first responders whose instinct to run towards danger saved the lives of many, and B, the professionalism of the Australian police, defence, diplomatic and medical staff who responded alongside their Indonesian counterparts with extraordinary courage and compassion in the aftermath of the attacks. 3, notes the strength of our friendship with Indonesia and the work we continue to do together, including to counter terrorism and violent extremism. And 4, calls on all Australians to keep those whose lives were lost in our thoughts on that day and over the coming weeks as this sad anniversary is observed.